Okay, in this lesson, we'll see how to set up and use PostgreSQL. But first, let's clarify some terminology. PostgreSQL is what we call a database management system, or DBMS. It's basically a software that manages data. And I'm sure you have already heard of many DBMS, like Oracle, DB2, Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL, and so on. PostgreSQL is a very popular open source DBMS, just like MySQL. The data managed by a DBMS is organized into the so-called databases. Each database contains a number of schema elements like tables, indexes, functions, and triggers, and so on, as shown in this figure. So now that we know what's a database and what's a DBMS, let's install the Postgres database software. The software can be downloaded from postgresql.org, and we're going to install it on Windows. There are two options to choose here, an installer package or a zip package, and we'll choose the installer package, which is much easier to use. And when you download the installer, make sure you download the right version, in particular whether it's for 32-bit operating system or for 64-bit. If you are not sure about your operating system, just right-click on My Computer, select Properties, and you can see here that it says 64-bit operating system. So we'll download this Windows 64-bit version. To save some time, I have already downloaded the package here, and let's install it. So my computer is a little bit slow. It may take a little longer than you would expect. Okay, so first, this is the installation directory. It is, of course, where the software will be installed. If you want to use a command line client later on, you would want to remember this directory, because this is where you'll look for the command line client. And on my computer, it's going to be program files PostgreSQL 9.4, and so we'll go there later. And then you would want to choose a data directory. This is where the databases will be stored, and we'll leave it to default. And then we would need to create a password for the super user called Postgres. And this is a built-in super user account for the database system, and later on we'll log into this account to create more users. So let's give it a password, because this database is installed on my laptop. It's unlikely that it will be remotely accessed, so I'll choose a simple password. And this is a port where the database server accepts network connections, and by default, PostgreSQL server uses the port 5432. It's pretty easy to remember, 5432. And again, we'll leave it as is. And also, we'll leave the locale to default. And that's about it. Okay, it says starting the database server. That's good. Okay, great. In the last step, it says Stack Builder may be used to download and install additional tools. We don't need those additional tools, so let's uncheck this and then click Finish. So now Postgres is installed, and as I said, the server is running, and let's see how we can use it. The first thing we must understand is that virtually every DBMS uses a client and server architecture. The software we just installed and ran was a server software that is responsible for managing the databases. In order to access the databases, we need to use a separate piece of software, the client, like the GUI client pgAdmin III, or the command line client psql, or later the applications that you will develop. And those applications are also considered database clients when they access a database. In any case, notice that in order to connect the client to the server, you need to create a database connection. There are 5 things involved in establishing a database connection, no matter what DBMS you use. So these are 5 pretty important things, and almost all problems involved in database access has something to do with one of those things. So keep these things in mind. So the first thing we need to know is the host of the database server, and for that we need to provide the host name or IP address of the server. For example, sometimes if it's on the local host, you will say localhost, or if it's on a different server, you would give the server's host name and so on. And then the port number, as I mentioned, by default, PostgreSQL server uses the port number 5432, and for the vast majority of the time, this is the number you would use. And to access databases, you typically need to log in as a database user, hence the username and password. And last but not least, of course, you need to know the name of the database, which you would need to provide when you create a database connection. Okay, so having these 5 things in mind, let's see how we can use the GUI client pgAdmin III to access our Postgres databases. And pgAdmin III is installed together with your Postgres server when you install it, and here it is. So click on that, and by default, when you install pgAdmin III, it automatically creates a connection for you. But before we try to make the connection and do something with it, let's understand what this one means. So right click on that and then select properties, and you can see this connection has some fields here. First is the connection name. This one doesn't really matter, you can name it anything. And notice that host, port, username, password, database, right? And here it says host, which is localhost, meaning that the server actually is running on the same computer as the client. And the port number, and the service, the name of the Windows service, we can leave that empty. And the maintenance DB is the database you try to connect to, and here it says Postgres, which is a database name, not the username, by the way, it's a database name, and that's fine. And by default, when you install a Postgres database server, it also creates a couple of other databases, EDB and in particular template 1. So oftentimes when you try to connect to a database server. If you don't have if you didn't already created a database, you would want to connect to this database called template1. But for Postgres, user will use Postgres. And username is Postgres, and then password is the password we just created, and the rest are not very important. Okay. And then let's log in. Enter the password I created during installation, and now we are connected to the server. So what do we do after connecting to the server? Well, we can create more users, create another database, run some SQL statements, run some scripts, and let's see how we do that. So first of all, under databases, you can see that we currently have this Postgres database. Let's say we want to create a new database. So right-click, select new database, and then we'll create a new database called test1. And that is that. Now double-click on the database. So now we are connected to test1 instead of Postgres. And if you look under a database, you can see a bunch of things. And the things that you would typically look for are the tables. And where are the tables? Well, in Postgres, the tables are actually under something called a schema and then public. And a schema is, you can think of a schema as an intermediate level between a database and the tables and other schema elements. In other words, imagine that under the database bubble, there are smaller bubbles called schemas, and then inside each schema bubble, you have your tables, views, and procedures, and so on. So it's like an intermediate layer in this context. Many databases have many DBMS have the schema level, but some do not. And in some DBMS, schema and the databases mean the same thing. But in Postgres SQL, you have the schema level. Okay, so let's say that we want to create a table, and we can use SQL create statement, just like what we learned from our SQL classes. So click on the SQL button, and let's say we do create table, my table, and ID integer, name varchar, and okay, so click on execute, and this one should have created a table for us. And if we refresh and look under the public schema and look under tables, you can see that this is a table we just created called my table, right? And as you can see, you can use this interface to run your SQL statements. Is pretty simple, and if you run a query, the output will be shown in this panel. And oftentimes, instead of individual SQL statements, we may also need to run SQL scripts. For example, this is an SQL script that contains several SQL statements, create table, inserts, and so on. And if we want to run that script, all we need to do is open it and then say run, and it should run the scripts. And let's see, refresh, and you can see that now we have the users and authorities table created from our database script. And okay, so we did creating database SQL statements and SQL scripts, and let's create one more user. A user in Postgres is called a login row. So to create a user, right-click on login row and select new login row. Notice that currently we only have one login row called Postgres, and let's create a new one. And the row name is basically the username. I'll call it CYSum. And the password, I'll again choose a simple password and say OK. Oh, actually, let's give this CYSum user the privilege to create databases. So CYSum will be able to create databases. Or you can also give CYSum additional privileges, but I want to have a somewhat regular user account without lots of security privileges. So just creating database privilege. Okay, so this is how you can use the pgAdmin III GUI client. Is GUI, so it's relatively easy to use. And for those of you who likes to use a command line client, there's also a command line client called psql, and let's see how we can use that. And let's just close this one. And okay, so if we open up a command window and type psql, there's nothing there, and this is because by default psql is not in the command path, so we have to add that so Windows know where to find this client software. Remember Postgres was installed under program files PostgreSQL 9.4, and the psql command line client is under the directory bin, and you can see it's right here. So let's add this path to Windows search path. So copy this path and go to right-click on Computer Properties, Advanced System Settings, and Environment Variable. We would want to add that path to the Path Environment Variable. So click Edit. You can see that currently the path environment variable contains a number of paths, and they are separated by semicolons. So to add our path to it, add another semicolon and paste that path here, and that should do it. Okay, so if we open a command window again, and this time Windows can find the client software, and now it's asking for password. Now the question here is what password? Right now we have two users, Postgres, the built-in super user, and the CYSum, the newly created user. So which password should we use here? Well, to answer that question, we need to understand the connection defaults used by the command line client. Remember that the command line client is just another client, and in order to create a connection, it needs to provide host, port, username, password, database. And currently, when we type psql, we didn't provide anything. So what are the values for those 5 things? Well, if we don't provide any parameters, by default, the host is localhost, and the default port is 5432, and those are exactly what we want, so that's great. And the default user is the current user who's logged into the system, and I'm currently logged in as the user CY_Sung. So by default, the user is actually CY_Sung. So notice that here it's not the Postgres user, it's the current user who's logged in, and in my case, it's CY_Sung. So accordingly, this password should be CY_Sung's password. Now, if I type in the password, I would see an error that says database CY_Sung does not exist. What does that mean? It means that once again, it has something to do with the default value. Notice that we didn't provide the database name either, and this client will try to connect to a database, and by default, the database name is the same as the username. So in other words, if we don't provide anything on the command line, it tries to connect to a database that is also called CY_Sung, and that's why we got the error like this, because we didn't have a database called CY_Sung yet. But that's okay. So what we can do is we can say psql and then existing database name. Remember that when you install Postgres, it automatically created a couple of databases, and one of them is called template1. So let's connect to template1 first. And this time we can log in, and remember we logged in as a user CY_Sung, and also remember that user CY_Sung has the privilege to create more databases. So let's do a create database CY_Sung, and now we have created a new database that has the same name as the user. And the next time, if I do psql, there won't be any error because now it's automatically connected to the database CY_Sung. Okay, so now that we are connected, let's perform a few operations. So we have already created a database, and if we want, we can create a table. Let's say create table test1, ID integer, name varchar, and we can do select statement, and we can see what tables are created under this database and so on. And if we want to run any SQL scripts, we can do, well, first of all, let's go to the folder where that SQL script is. And there are two ways to run the script. The easiest way is probably simply pipe the script into the client by doing this. And if we log in, we can see that the two tables, users and authorities, are created. And we can do a select statement to see the content of the table. So, in my opinion, in many cases, using the command line client is actually more efficient than using the GUI, especially, for example, when you try to run an SQL script. But to use the command line effectively, you'll need to do a little bit learning. So, if you do psql --help, you'll see all the command line options, and inside psql you can use /q to quit the client, and you can use /? to see all the / commands, and you can use /h and then SQL command to see the documentation of the SQL commands, which is quite convenient. For example, I often forget the syntax of the alter table statement, so I can do a /h and then alter table, and it tells me the syntax of how to use the alter table statement. Okay, so that's it for this lesson. Hope you enjoy using PostgreSQL. It's my favorite DBMS, so hope you like it too.